I would like to thank you all again today for joining me. Today we're going to talk about how the federal government of Canada has come out and claimed that provinces could make medicine mandatory. So let's read what this article has to say. Provinces are likely to introduce mandatory medicine policies in the coming months to deal with surging COVID-19 caseloads, says Health Minister Jean-Yves Declos. Said today, and this is Friday, January the 7th. What Declos says is, what we see now is that our healthcare system in Canada is fragile, our people are tired, and the only way that we know to get through COVID-19, this variant, and any future variant is through medication. Now, they told us this about a year ago, that our way out of this pandemic was through 70% of the population getting their medicine. And I believe they kind of struggled with that. Some provinces more than others struggled with that, but we did meet that. We reopened. We reopened for good. Then came the fall, and here we are again locked down. And continuing to get worse lockdowns, by the way. Declos said that while rapid tests, masking, and social distancing are useful tools, they won't end the pandemic on their own. 50% of hospitalizations in Quebec are due to people not having been medicated. Well, that means the other 50% that are medicated are in hospital. Or at least that those who are hospitalized are medicated. So it's a 50-50. That's a burden on healthcare workers, a burden on society, which is very difficult to bear and for many people difficult to understand. I don't think personally that any politician, doctor, or person in authority or power should talk about their population as a burden. It's divisive. It's hurtful. It's wrong. We don't talk about people who get in car accidents, who drink and drive, who end up in the hospital or the ICU for months as a burden. We don't talk about obese people who ignore their diabetes, who lose their leg or their eyesight as a burden to our healthcare system. We don't talk about people who are obese and have health issues or heart issues as a burden to our healthcare system. These things happen. They can be avoided too. If you're not taking care of your diabetes and you end up chronically needing to be in and out of the hospital, that was preventable. Just as they say, this other 50% who are not medicated, well, it was preventable. You could have taken the medication and then you wouldn't be a burden to us. It's a very dangerous way to be speaking about people. It also greenlights the ability for some of these people, I would say about 15 to 20% of the people in Canada who believe wholeheartedly in this stuff, that it's okay to treat people who think differently than them on this topic in a grotesque manner, that you can discriminate against them because our government is discriminating against them. And this is our federal government. Any government official who does this should resign immediately. You are not fit for office. We need people in office who are going to unite us, who are going to lead with hope and resilience and find ways to overcome issues that don't infringe on people's fundamental rights. Let's continue. That's why I'm signaling this is a conversation on which I believe provinces and territories in support with the federal government will want to have over the next weeks and months. In support with the federal government. Now, I assume that means financial support, which leads me to wonder, are our premier's pockets being lined with money from the federal government to do these policies that go against what the population wants? And at least in my province, it's not even remotely the majority who support this. It's like 16% of Albertans support mandatory medication. 84% don't. Duclos said that while discussions about mandatory medicine policies are not taking place now, he believes that based on his personal understanding of what we see internationally and domestically and in conversations with health ministers over the last few weeks, the discussion will start in the coming weeks or months. Well, I'm not sure if this gentleman here has a good personal understanding of what he's seeing internationally and domestically, because internationally we're seeing massive protests across the EU. And domestically, there are many, many protests. I mean, if we look at what's happening in Quebec over the weekend, I'm pretty sure they had pretty large rallies that were occurring where people are saying no to these mandates. It's our choice. He did stress, however, that it's up to the provinces to decide whether to implement mandatory medicine policies, which is true. Healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction. Thank goodness, because the federal government leadership is not leadership. What they've been doing to unmedicated individuals across Canada, denying them EI, denying them financial resources, forcing them on the street, forcing them to decide whether or not they have to put their health and their life on the line in order to keep their job. And in Canada, the way our EI works, which is employment insurance, is that every paycheck you get taxed off of your income, off your earnings. And that goes into the federal pot, which is supposed to be designated for employment insurance, so that if you lose your job of no fault of your own, even if you lose your job of fault of your own, depending on what it is, I mean, unless it's fraud or theft or something, you should be able to get this. This is what we're paying in for. But our government has decided that if you have decided not to take your medicine, well, you're not entitled to what you've paid into. And there's many, probably millions of Canadians that are sitting at home who have lost their job, who are going bankrupt, losing their house, can't heat their houses in the winter, can't feed their families. It's not as simple as just go get it. It's not as simple as that. This is not a black and white issue. The health minister said the provinces are facing a perfect storm of record-setting case numbers, a shortage of healthcare workers, and up to 7 million eligible Canadians are still unmedicated. I believe Canada has a rate of 80% medicated. And yet we are still seeing record-setting case numbers. And I mean case numbers that we've never seen before throughout the pandemic. I think the last I saw, Ontario was about 16 to 18,000 cases a day. I've never heard of it being that high. And Ontario is one of the highest medicated provinces in all of Canada. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. It's just lies. It's all lies. He continues on to say, what we can do is provide medicines, tests, personal protective equipment. We can provide tracing support. We can provide all sorts of other non-human resource types of assistance. Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc said there are limits to what the federal government can do to ease these shortages of healthcare staff. The shortages of healthcare staff is the sole responsibility of every premier sitting in office who fired or put their healthcare staff on leaves without pay. That's not the federal government. That is the provincial governments. So I don't know why they're even crying about the shortages. They created them. And we can't let these people off the hook. They need to be held accountable. It's time that we keep these people accountable. These are our government officials. They've never lost a paycheck. They're continuing to get raises. They're not suffering. And yet they're the ones who are creating massive shortages, putting people onto the streets, making these policies, these grotesque policies. It's no surprise that provincial and territorial governments have considerably more health human resources, for example, than would the government of Canada, he said. Earlier this week, Quebec's health minister, Christian Dubé, announced that Quebecers will need to show proof that they are fully medicated in order to enter government-run liquor and cannabis shops as of January 18th. So you can't even go buy a bottle of booze if you're unmedicated. It's vindictive. Dubé said half of the people with COVID-19 being admitted to ICUs in the province are unmedicated, and that the new restrictions are needed to slow down hospital admissions. Again, half of the people with COVID-19 being admitted into ICUs are unmedicated, which only means that the other half are medicated. So it's 50-50. So the unmedicated then, therefore, are not creating any more of a burden than, say, the medicated. The minister also said that the Quebec government will soon expand the use of medication passports to other non-essential businesses, such as personal care services. That announcement is expected in the coming days. Right. It starts this way. Non-essential businesses, personal care services. Well, who's to say what personal care services are essential to who and what? And this is a slippery slope because next it's going to be the grocery stores. And we've already seen that being tried in Canada by New Brunswick. Because the New Brunswick premier tried to say that grocery stores were allowed to bar unmedicated people if they didn't show proof. That's ridiculous. So then people can't eat because they didn't take a medication that you told them to? We must remember that any form of medical intervention, may it be surgery, medication, injections, are up to the patient and solely the patient, not the doctor. The doctor is there to inform them of all and any options that they have. By limiting the places they can go, we're limiting their contacts, referring to the unmedicated. Again, this is just isolation. If you see my previous video before this, my first video, I go on and I talk about how they desocialize the population by isolating us. Because if the medication works, then the medicated are safe around the unmedicated. But we know that's not true because the case numbers keep rising and that it doesn't stop the spread and it doesn't stop people from going into hospitals. Because this article clearly states that 50% are non-medicated. If you don't want to get medicated, stay home. A spokesperson for Quebec's health minister said Friday, however, that mandatory medication is not something the province is looking at yet. Right. And I'm pretty sure Quebec just announced that you need your third shot to be considered fully medicated. And that's the problem with this, is where does it end? The third, the fourth, the fifth? Who gets to decide that? Shouldn't the individual get to decide how many of these medications they want, what they're comfortable with? I mean, it affects their lives. It affects their health. Doesn't affect your neighbors. It doesn't affect the politicians. Doesn't affect the doctors. It affects yours. Well, it'll affect the doctors if you end up in hospital because you have an adverse reaction or something else happens. In a social media post, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney said his government will not make medicine mandatory. Alberta's legislator removed the power of mandatory medicines from the Public Health Act last year and will not revisit that decision, period. I hope, Mr. Kenney, that you mean that. I really hope that you mean that, because we do have rights, regardless of what our federal government likes to think. While we strongly encourage those who are eligible to get medicated, it is ultimately a personal choice that individuals must take. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the medication is solely made just for the person. It's not made to protect other people. And, a lot of people like to act as if, I took this to help the betterment of everybody. But that's not true. People ran to these clinics when it first opened so that they could protect themselves, so that they were safe. It wasn't to make their neighbors safe. It wasn't to make me safe, you safe, or anybody safe. It was a solely selfish decision. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that's what they thought was the best decision for them, that's great. And you should have that right, just as others should have the right not to. But to sit here and now act because now we know that it doesn't stop anything, that you did it to help your coworker or your neighbor, is a lie. It's an absolute lie. Robert Strang, Chief Medical Officer of Nova Scotia, told CBC that his province isn't considering mandatory medication, but is looking at increasing the number of places in the province that can be accessed only by those who are fully medicated. Well, that's just discriminatory. To me, it's a bigger step further to say you have to be medicated. First of all, how would we ever enforce that? There's all sorts of legal and human rights issues. Well, you dang right there are. I think we need to be in the space that we ultimately allow people the choice. But that choice means that there's a lot of restrictions on what they can do compared to the people who are medicated. Discrimination through and through. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe issued a statement saying that while he strongly encourages people to get medicated, his province will not implement a mandatory medication policy. Some European countries, such as Austria and Greece, have moved in the direction already as infection rates hit records high and medication campaigns stall. Right, and look what happened to them. Here's a prime example. Look at the amount of people protesting against these policies. I think this article brings up a lot of questions, and it brings up a lot of points that the government seems to negate or walk around or just completely ignore. For instance, this entire pandemic, what has the federal government or provincial governments done? They have locked us in our homes. They have restricted us from doing things, working from home. Once the medications became available, people ran out and got them. And then that stalled pretty quick. They weren't getting the numbers that they wanted. So then they started these lotteries to increase people. Alberta gave out $2 million in 2 different lotteries, 1 million to one person, 1 million to the other. And then they got their numbers. But that wasn't good enough again. And then they had to do another campaign where they would give you $100 in order to get your medication. It's coercion. It's not the way to be going. And as far as I'm concerned, it should be highly illegal. What really concerns me about this whole pandemic, if it is as real and as detriment to our healthcare system as they state, which I'm not saying it's not, but to deny the fact that our healthcare system wasn't crumbling decades prior to this pandemic is delusional. Because the fact is that our healthcare system has been failing for a long time and our governments have done nothing. So I wonder if this has been such an issue, why have we not done mass training of more nurses? At least an idea. We could have taken 3rd and 4th year nursing students and put them on and made it a co-op program, and they could have learned hands-on. And sometimes the best way is hands-on learning. They also did minimal to no capacity limits or field hospitals. If we're sitting here saying that our hospitals are at a brink, why are no field hospitals being made? We saw in China, now propaganda may it be, but we saw in China at the beginning when they ran out of hospitals, they built hospitals quickly so that they had places for their people. The other question we have to ask is, why did we fire healthcare staff across the country? Now, I have a graphic here. Okay. Healthcare workers facing unpaid leave or termination by province. So this is all of Canada here. Hopefully you all can see it. Okay. And we can see here in BC, in British Columbia, the amount of nurses that are either on unpaid leave or who were terminated are 3,325. If we look at Alberta here, we have 1,650. Saskatchewan, we have 1,100. Manitoba, we have 176. Ontario, we have 1,665. And that was with Ontario, wasn't going through with the provincial government mandate. So I believe that this is hospital by hospital. So some hospitals had mandates, and those nurses and doctors or paramedics either were terminated or on leave. And then other hospitals didn't. So that was probably depending on what hospitals thought that they could use or lose personnel. Same with Quebec. They did the same type of policy, and they lost 458. And Quebec has had trouble throughout the pandemic. I mean, their doctors have been screaming the entire time they don't have enough staff. They've had to close ERs and stuff like that, which so has Alberta, and we will get to that. We look at New Brunswick. We have 734. Nova Scotia, 531. There's no data for Newfoundland or the territories, Nunavut, Northwest, and the Yukon, 14. Okay, so if we look further down this rabbit hole here. So AHS, so Alberta Health Services, medicine mandate, 1,650 employees put on unpaid leave while some offered rapid testing option. Why were some offered rapid testing option? I believe that some were offered the rapid testing option in order to keep rural hospitals open or urgent cares open. Alberta Health Services shut down the ER in 4 rural hospitals in November. Combined, the 4 hospitals were closed for over 150 hours last month. So if we have a pandemic and we have 4 hospitals closed, their ERs closed, how are those people supposed to get care? Again, Alberta Health Services cut services during the holiday in 7 rural hospitals throughout December. This is over the holidays, so over the Christmas holidays, 2 weeks period. Now, they say that it's because they can't get enough doctors into these rural hospitals. And that, yes, these issues were occurring prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. That doesn't excuse the fact that these personnel who are on unpaid leave is exasperating the situation. In British Columbia, they had more than 4,000 healthcare workers remain unmedicated. Now, we can see from this other thing that did drop from 4,000 down to 3,325. And this is just causing great problems, not just with ER shutting down or rural hospitals shutting down, but the paramedic times. They're going through the roof. We don't have enough paramedics to make these calls. There's shortages everywhere, not just healthcare, all across the country. If it's through the police force, soon we're going to have truck shortages because Trudeau has a mandatory medication policy so that if you are a trucker and you're unmedicated by January 17th, you're no longer allowed to work. You can't drive your truck by yourself to and from a place to pick up and drop off essential goods. Now here it says that the only way we know how to get through COVID-19, this variant, and any future variant is through medication. Interesting. Because if we look at one of the leading countries in the world, Israel, on medication and how many doses of medication people have, they already have 3 doses. Currently, they have 3 doses. So they're ahead of the entire world. And yet they're still having outbreaks. So what did Israel do? They started administering their 4th medication doses. I don't understand. If 3 in 12 months hasn't been effective, what makes them think that the 4th is going to be the dream shot? Okay, let's say it is. Then that means that the proper testing that they should have done for these medications and the dosing should have been figured out in clinical trials on animals. If we look at United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, these are inalienable rights. Article 3, within the UN, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Now, I am pretty sure that every country that is talking about these medication policies have signed this UN declaration and are violating it. Especially when you hear your prime minister talk about whether or not we should be tolerating the unmedicated.
Oui, on va s'en sortir de cette pandémie par la vaccination. Puis on en connaît tous des gens qui sont en train d'hésiter un petit peu. On va continuer d'essayer de les convaincre. Mais il y a aussi des gens qui sont farouchement opposés à la vaccination.
Qui sont extrémistes.
Qui croient pas dans la science, qui sont souvent misogynes, souvent racistes aussi. C'est un petit groupe, mais qui prend de la place. Et là, il faut faire un choix en tant que leader, en tant que pays. Est-ce qu'on tolère ces gens-là ou est-ce qu'on dit, voyons, la plupart des gens, presque 80% des Québécois ont fait ce qu'il fallait faire, se sont fait vacciner, on veut revenir aux choses qu'on aime faire. C'est pas ces gens-là qui vont nous bloquer maintenant.
Finally, if we look at the Nuremberg Code, which I'm pretty sure all the same countries who were talking about doing these policies have signed. Number 1. The voluntary consent of human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior forms of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him or make an understanding and enlightened decision. This latter element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be concluded, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person, which may possibly come from his participating in the experiment. The duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is a personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to another with impunity. Experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society. Now, they tell us that this is for the good of society because it's going to get us out of the pandemic. They told us that at the beginning of 2021. If we all get it, we will all be open. We'd all be back to normal. It's for the good of society. Didn't work. Now people are being pressured into the third, and in some cases the fourth. Depending on where you are in the world. I mean, if you're in Israel, you're now on your fourth. Unprocurable by other methods or means of study and not random and unnecessary in nature. Well, I would say at this point, third and fourth medicated shots is unnecessary. Was it fruitful? Were the results actually good? Because it kind of seems like it's a 50-50% chance. Third one. The experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problem under study, that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. Now, they anticipated that the results were that they were 95% effective. And we found out that to be a lie. They also said that the anticipated results were that it was going to stop transmission. That was a lie. They also now are telling us that the anticipated results are that, well, it reduces your severity and hospitalization. I think that is yet to be seen. Right. The experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Well, that's not happening because there's many people who are physically injured and there's a lot more silent people who are mentally suffering, who were forced into this, taking the medication for their jobs. And I know a few who were forced against their will. 5. No experiment should be conducted where there is a reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experiment physicians also serve as subjects. So I guess what they're saying here that is if you believe that there's going to be a disability or death as an injury, that it shouldn't be conducted. And I think that this is a clear signal right now that we need to stop what's going on, because there are a lot of people who are being disabled permanently and others that are just outright dead. I mean, I think VAERS is now at 21,000 people who have passed away from these medications. And that's a lot, 21,000. And that's just what's reported. How many people are dying months later of heart attacks, blood clots, strokes, issues that maybe are not getting linked back to the medication that they took? Because sometimes these things don't pop up within a month. Sometimes it doesn't pop up within weeks. I mean, sometimes it can take years. So when we talk about disabilities, what are we doing to people's immune systems? Because evidence is showing now that these medications actually downregulate the immune system. I think another good point that we need to discuss within is that the government has taken no action or responsibility for their lack of inaction throughout this entire pandemic. The only thing our governments can seem to do is restrict us, isolate us, and mandate us. This is a really slippery slope, because if we lose the right to our bodies, we are no longer free. We are slaves to our government. They can pass these and mandate this. It doesn't end here. It begins here. What other emergencies can they claim and force medication upon people? Could they use climate change against us? Say we're overpopulated. It's an emergency. We must sterilize a subsection of the population. Only specific people in which who we see fit should be able to reproduce. Who are these people? What authority do they have over any one of us? They're no better. They're no different. They are people just like us. We cannot give them this power. We have to stand up.